What if the most painful royal announcement of the year didn't come with trumpets, cameras, or a balcony appearance, but with silence? Because according to palace watchers, that's exactly how today began. No press conference, no dramatic speech, just a sealed decision circulating behind closed doors, and a wave of shock that would ripple far beyond palace walls. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. At the center of it all stands King Charles III, a monarch already navigating illness, family fractures, and an institution under constant scrutiny. But insiders say this moment was different. He wasn't acting as a father, or even as a grandfather. He was acting as the crown. And the names tied to this moment are two children the world has watched grow up through carefully controlled images and rare appearances. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor. Here's the question no one was prepared to hear out loud. What happens when royal status itself is suddenly in question? For years, rumors swirled at the edges of public conversation, quickly dismissed, firmly denied, often labeled cruel or inappropriate. But behind the scenes, royal protocol doesn't run on emotions. It runs on verification, on law, on documents that don't care about headlines or feelings. And according to multiple reports, those documents became the problem. This story matters now because timing matters in monarchy. Succession clarity matters. Legal definition matters, especially when a slimmed-down monarchy is under pressure to justify every title, every privilege, every line in the royal registry. And today, sources claim, the palace reached a point where delay was no longer possible. Think about the weight of that decision. Two children, born into one of the most scrutinized families on earth, suddenly tied to a controversy they didn't create. A grandfather forced to choose between compassion and constitutional duty, and a public that has been told, repeatedly, that everything was settled. So why revisit it now? Why today? Why, after years of silence, did the palace allegedly move forward with a decision so final it could never be quietly undone? Some say it was pressure. Others say it was inevitability. A few claim it was triggered by something specific, something reviewed, flagged, and escalated internally. And that's the part that changes everything. Because according to insiders, the decision wasn't driven by rumor or tabloids or online speculation. It was driven by something far more dangerous to the monarchy than gossip. Paperwork. Verified, reviewed, and placed directly in front of the king. And once that happened, there was no turning back. But what exactly did the palace see, and why did it force a line to be drawn today? Because what came next would set off a chain reaction no one outside those walls was supposed to witness. So what was in that paperwork? Here's the part that makes palace aides uncomfortable. Because according to people familiar with the process, this wasn't about rumors. It wasn't about social media. It wasn't even about public opinion. It was about a review that had been quietly postponed again and again until it couldn't be postponed anymore. In the monarchy, reviews like this don't happen unless something triggers them. A change in law, a shift in status, or a discrepancy that refuses to stay buried. And this one, insiders say, refused to go away. For years, the palace relied on a strategy of distance. Say nothing. Confirm nothing. Let time soften the edges. After all, the children were living outside the UK. Their parents had stepped away from royal duties. The public-facing risk felt manageable. But behind the scenes, a different calculation was unfolding. Royal titles are not symbolic decorations. They are legal designations tied to succession, security protocols, funding eligibility, and constitutional recognition. You don't inherit them because of headlines. You inherit them because the law says you do. And that's where the delay began to crack. According to sources, internal reviews raised questions that no one wanted to answer publicly. Not accusations. Questions. The most dangerous kind. Questions that required verification rather than reassurance. At the center of those questions was Prince Harry, not as a public figure, but as a legal reference point. Because under royal law, lineage is not assumed. It is documented. Ask yourself this. If titles are granted automatically, why does the palace keep records so obsessively? Why does every royal birth come with formal notices, jurisdictional clarity, and verification across multiple institutions? Because once something enters the line of succession, reversing it is almost impossible without consequences. And that's why, insiders claim, the palace hesitated. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. Each delay buying time, but also compounding risk. Because the longer something remains unresolved, the more explosive it becomes if exposed later. Think about the pressure this creates. On legal advisors. On constitutional experts. On a king who already inherited a fragile institution in a modern world that questions everything. So why move now? According to reports, the answer is brutally simple. The palace allegedly reached a point where continuing to delay posed a greater threat than acting. If you're King Charles, you're not just asking what's kind. You're asking what's defensible. What survives scrutiny? What protects the crown long after you're gone? And that's where the decision shifted from emotional to procedural. Sources say a final internal briefing laid out the consequences in stark terms. If titles remained in place without absolute clarity, future challenges could unravel not just this decision, but others tied to succession legitimacy. That's not drama. That's constitutional risk. And so, reluctantly, deliberately, the palace moved forward. Not loudly, not publicly at first, but decisively. And yet, even as the decision took shape, there was one detail that unsettled everyone involved. Because according to insiders, the paperwork didn't just raise questions about titles. It raised questions about recognition itself. And once those questions were formally acknowledged, there was no longer any safe way to pretend they didn't exist. But what exactly triggered that final briefing? And why did it force the palace to act now, instead of waiting even longer? Because the answer leads directly to the question no one was ever supposed to ask out loud. And that's where this story turns. What was the one question that froze the room? According to people briefed on the process, it wasn't shouted. It wasn't dramatic. It was asked calmly, almost clinically. And that's what made it so unsettling. Are the existing records sufficient to meet the legal threshold required for continued recognition? That's it. One sentence. No emotion. No accusation. Just a question that carried consequences no one wanted to face. Inside the palace, questions like that don't exist in a vacuum. They echo down corridors, trigger secondary reviews, and pull in departments that rarely speak to one another unless something has gone very wrong. Legal advisors, constitutional experts, external counsel, all looping back to one uncomfortable reality. Silence is a strategy until it isn't. For years, the monarchy relied on restraint. Say less. Show less. Protect the children by keeping them out of the spotlight. That approach worked publicly. But internally, restraint created a different problem. Because when something isn't addressed, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And waiting has a cost. According to insiders, the palace had already been fielding quiet questions from outside institutions. Not tabloids. Not bloggers. But entities that operate on documentation and precedent. Institutions that don't accept assurances. Only proof. That's when the contradiction became impossible to ignore. On one hand, the public narrative said everything was settled. On the other, internal reviews kept returning with footnotes, asterisks, and requests for clarification. Not conclusions. Clarifications. The kind that keep lawyers awake at night. Ask yourself this. Why would an institution that survives on tradition suddenly become obsessed with technicalities? Because tradition doesn't protect you in court. And that's where the emotional weight of this decision becomes impossible to avoid. Because no one involved wanted to be the person who forced this question forward. No one wanted to be responsible for what would happen next. Imagine sitting in that room. The history on the walls. The portraits staring back. Knowing that whatever is decided will follow these children for the rest of their lives. Yet knowing that doing nothing could damage the institution meant to outlast everyone in the room. That's the contradiction at the heart of this story. Compassion pulling one way, duty pulling the other. And according to sources, the moment that tipped the balance didn't come from the king himself. It came from a report, a formal, structured review that summarized years of unresolved issues into a single conclusion. Further delay increases institutional risk. Those words are devastating in their simplicity, because once risk is acknowledged in writing, it demands action. Not tomorrow. Not next year. Now. That's when the palace shifted from asking whether it should act to deciding how. How do you move forward without detonating public trust? How do you protect children while enforcing rules designed centuries before their birth? And how do you announce something this heavy without saying the one thing everyone will assume anyway? According to insiders, that final question shaped everything that followed. Because the palace knew whatever it said, and whatever it didn't say, would be dissected, interpreted, and weaponized. And so they chose restraint again. Minimal language. Legal precision. No commentary. But even restraint has consequences. Because once the question was asked internally, it didn't stay there. It moved. Quietly. Deliberately. Toward a decision that would strip symbols, not identities. And toward a moment when the palace would have to act, without explaining everything. But the most explosive part of the story isn't the question itself. It's the answer the palace concluded it could no longer avoid. And that answer led directly to the move that stunned everyone watching from the outside. Because when the decision finally came, it wasn't about lineage alone. It was about survival. So when the decision finally surfaced, many people misunderstood it immediately. Because the palace didn't announce a punishment. It announced a recalibration. That distinction matters more than it sounds. Here's the shocking part. According to insiders, the removal of titles was not framed internally as a judgment on the children themselves. It was framed as a safeguard, a containment measure, a way to prevent future legal, constitutional, and institutional fallout from spiraling out of control. In other words, the palace wasn't trying to erase anyone. It was trying to close a door before it blew off its hinges. Royal titles come with consequences most people never see. Automatic inclusion in constitutional frameworks. Eligibility for security considerations. Placement within historic records that are referenced decades, even centuries later. Once those titles are embedded, undoing them becomes nearly impossible without a public reckoning far worse than a quiet adjustment now. That's the logic advisors reportedly put in front of the king. And it's here that King Charles III faced the most painful contradiction of his reign so far. Because acting as a grandfather would mean shielding. Acting as a monarch meant clarifying. Sources say the final language was agonized over. Every word weighed. Every omission deliberate. Notice what the palace did not do. There was no press conference. No emotional framing. No attempt to explain motives or address speculation. Silence again. Why? Because explanation invites argument. Argument invites scrutiny. And scrutiny, in this case, was exactly what the palace was trying to avoid. Think about it from their perspective. The moment they start explaining, they validate the very questions they spent years trying not to amplify. They open themselves up to demands for evidence, counterclaims, and endless public debate about matters the monarchy has always treated as private. So instead, they did something colder, more controlled. They adjusted the record. Titles removed. Privileges withdrawn. Status clarified. Nothing more. Nothing less. But here's where the emotional irony cuts deepest. By removing royal titles, the palace arguably reduced the children's exposure to controversy. No HRH. No automatic placement in royal narratives. No expectation that they represent an institution embroiled in disputes their parents continue to navigate. Protection through subtraction. And yet, to the outside world, it looks brutal, abrupt, even cruel. That's the paradox. The same action can be interpreted as punishment or protection, depending on where you stand. Ask yourself this. If the palace truly wanted to harm these children, would it have acted quietly? Or would it have let speculation rage unchecked? Insiders insist this was the least explosive option left. But there's something else the palace didn't say. Something noticeably absent from every carefully worded line. They did not deny the underlying questions. They didn't confirm them either. But they didn't close the door. And in royal communication, what isn't denied is often as telling as what is stated. That omission is deliberate. Because denial locks you into a position. Silence leaves flexibility. Silence allows the palace to move forward without anchoring itself to a narrative that could evolve. And that's why this decision feels unfinished. Because while titles were removed, the story didn't end there. According to insiders, this move was only the visible part of a much larger restructuring taking place behind the scenes. One that involves records, recognition, and long-term implications that won't surface immediately. So while the world focused on the headlines, the palace was already looking ahead. To the aftermath, to the response, and to the one reaction they knew would be impossible to control. Because the moment this decision became public, someone else would be forced to respond. And when that response comes, It could fracture what little silence remains. So where does that leave us now? Strip away the headlines. Remove the noise. Forget the outrage and the defenses for a moment. What you're left with is something far more uncomfortable than a royal controversy. You're left with two children whose lives were shaped by a system that runs on rules written long before they were born. This is the part most people miss. The palace didn't wake up one morning and decide to be cruel. Institutions don't operate on impulse. They operate on thresholds. And according to insiders, a threshold was crossed. When King Charles III acted, he wasn't rewriting history. He was narrowing risk. He was choosing the option advisors described as least destabilizing in the long term, even if it looked devastating in the short term. That doesn't make it painless. It makes it calculated. And yet, calculation doesn't erase the human cost. Think about it. Identity isn't just about bloodlines or documents. It's about how the world sees you, how your name is framed before you ever get to speak for yourself. Titles can be removed with a stroke of a pen, but questions linger. They always do. This decision doesn't answer everything. In fact, it does the opposite. It confirms that something was unresolved long enough to require action. It confirms that silence was no longer sustainable. And it confirms that the monarchy, for all its ceremony, is ultimately governed by systems that don't bend easily to emotion. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The crown survives by choosing continuity over comfort. Every monarch eventually faces a moment where personal pain collides with institutional survival. This appears to be that moment for King Charles. But if you're wondering whether this story is finished, the answer is no. Not even close. Because decisions like this don't exist in isolation. They trigger responses. Legal, personal, public. And some of those responses are already forming, quietly, away from cameras.